My daughter stood in the center of the kitchen, her designer heels clicking impatiently against the marble floor. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered an ultimatum that erased 38 years of fatherhood in a single breath. You either put on a white shirt and serve my husband tonight, or you get out of this house. I did not yell. I did not remind her who actually owned the ground she stood on. I simply smiled, walked to my room, packed a single leather suitcase, and quietly drove away. 5 days later, I sat on the balcony of my hotel penthouse, sipping black coffee, and watched my phone screen light up for the 50th time. 50 missed calls, all from her, all completely ignored. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not demanded, and that sometimes the most devastating response is absolute silence. Now, let us go back to where this adjustment began. The morning sun barely crested the tree line of the Connecticut estate when the heavy oak door to my quarters swung open without a knock. I lived in the East Guest Wing, a space I had originally designed as a quiet retreat for my late wife, Evelyn. Now, it was treated as the servant quarters. Bradley, my son-in-law, stood in the doorway holding a crumpled piece of yellow paper. He wore a silk robe that cost more than his struggling tech consulting firm made in a week. He did not say good morning. He tossed the yellow paper onto my reading table. It was a dry cleaning ticket. He told me his custom Italian suits needed to be picked up by noon because he had an incredibly important dinner to host that evening. He said it with the tone of a master giving instructions to a hired hand. He reminded me that since I was living under his roof rent-free, the least I could do was make myself useful to the man who was actually providing for the family. I looked at the yellow ticket. I looked at Bradley. I did not point out the fact that the mortgage for this massive estate had been paid off by me 20 years ago. I did not mention that the deed was held in a blind trust that I controlled. When Evelyn passed away, I stepped back from my commercial real estate empire. I wanted a quiet life. Natalie and Bradley assumed my silence meant I was a broken, senile old man. They assumed the estate had passed to Natalie. I let them believe it, hoping to see the true content of their character. I was seeing it now, clearer every single day. I picked up the ticket and told him I would handle it. Bradley smirked, turned around, and walked away, complaining loudly to Natalie down the hall about how he had to manage every little detail in this house. I finished my morning tea, dressed in a simple pair of slacks and a sweater, and walked out to the garage. I drove my modest sedan to the premium dry cleaners downtown. The owner, a sharp man who had known me for 2 decades, brought out Bradley's suits. The bill was $400. Bradley had conveniently forgotten to give me any cash or a credit card to pay for the errand. This was a deliberate test, a petty power play to force me to spend my meager pension on his luxury items. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a simple silver money clip. Tucked beneath a few $20 bills was a heavy matte black piece of metal, an exclusive corporate Centurion card, the kind of card issued only to individuals with 8-figure assets. The owner of the dry cleaner swiped the card without a word, handed me the receipt, and gave me a knowing nod. He was one of the few people in this town who knew that Vincent, the quiet widower, was also Vincent, the majority shareholder of the largest commercial development group in the state. I took the suits, drove back to the estate, and hung them perfectly in Bradley's massive walk-in closet. I was not being subservient. I was meticulously documenting their behavior, gathering every piece of data I needed for the inevitable reckoning. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the illusion of Bradley and Natalie's perfect life began to fracture violently. I sat in my wing, reading a book, while the sounds of absolute panic echoed from the main kitchen. Tonight was not just a dinner party. Bradley was hosting 3 major venture capitalists. His consulting firm was hemorrhaging money, and he needed a massive cash injection to keep his leased sports cars and luxury office space afloat. The entire evening hinged on projecting an image of effortless wealth and success. Then the phone rang. It was the exclusive catering company they had hired. I walked into the hallway just in time to see Natalie drop her phone onto the kitchen island, her face pale. The caterers had canceled. There had been a massive equipment failure at their commercial kitchen, and they could not fulfill the order. The dinner was less than 4 hours away. Bradley stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed red with rage. He began pacing frantically, swearing and blaming Natalie for not hiring a backup service. Natalie screamed back, reminding him that his credit card had been declined twice that week, and she had to beg the caterers to even take the job. The polished veneer they showed the world was gone. They were two desperate people standing in a house they did not own, realizing their entire lifestyle was a house of cards about to collapse. Bradley demanded that Natalie start cooking. Natalie stared at him in disbelief, stating she had not cooked a full meal in 5 years and certainly could not prepare a 5-course dinner for venture capitalists. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every insecurity, every financial lie they had told each other was bubbling to the surface. They needed a solution, and they needed someone to blame. That is when Natalie turned and saw me standing quietly in the hallway. Her eyes narrowed. The panic in her expression shifted instantly into a cold, calculating cruelty. She walked toward me, her heels striking the floor like hammer blows. She reached into the pantry and pulled out a pristine white button-down shirt, the kind a professional server would wear. She shoved it into my hands. She told me that I was going to help them. She said there were steaks in the freezer and vegetables in the fridge. She ordered me to cook the meal and then put on the white shirt to serve the guests. She told me to count like a hired butler so Bradley would not lose face in front of his investors. I stood perfectly still, looking at the cheap cotton shirt in my hands. I looked at my daughter, a woman I had raised with every privilege, a woman who was now treating me like a piece of disposable property. I told her no. I kept my voice low, steady, and completely devoid of emotion. I told her I was her father, not her employee, and I would not participate in this charade. Bradley stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. He told me I was an ungrateful old man. He said I contributed absolutely nothing to the household, that I was a drain on their resources, and that I should be on my knees thanking him for letting me live in his home. He pointed a finger inches from my face and told me I was going to put on the shirt and serve his guests, or he would physically throw my belongings onto the street. Natalie did not stop him. She did not defend me. She crossed her arms and delivered the final, fatal blow to our relationship. She told me Bradley was the man of this house now. She said I had outlived my usefulness. "You either serve my husband," she spat, "or you get out. We do not have room for a freeloader." The air in the kitchen went completely still. I looked at Bradley's arrogant sneer. I looked at Natalie's cold, entitled eyes. I saw exactly who they were. There was nothing left to salvage. The daughter I loved had been consumed by greed, and the man she married was nothing more than a parasite. They wanted me gone. They were about to get exactly what they asked for, but in a way they could never possibly imagine. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the shirt back at them. I did not mention the blind trust, the property deed, or the millions of dollars sitting in accounts they knew nothing about. I simply nodded my head once. I turned around and walked back down the long hallway to the guest wing. I pulled my vintage leather suitcase from the top of the closet. I did not pack everything. I did not need to. I packed 3 tailored suits, a few casual outfits, my medications, and a framed photograph of Evelyn. I left the rest of the clothes in the drawers. I left the books on the shelves. I left no note. I walked out the side door, bypassing the kitchen entirely. The late afternoon air was crisp and clean. I walked to the detached three-car garage. I did not walk toward the modest sedan I used for daily errands. I walked to the far corner, pulled off a heavy canvas dust cover, and unlocked the door to my midnight blue luxury Grand Tourer. I started the engine. The deep, powerful rumble echoed in the enclosed space. I pressed the garage door opener, backed out onto the sweeping circular driveway, and drove away from the estate I had built from the ground up. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I pulled out onto the main highway, the tires gripping the asphalt as I accelerated. I pressed a button on the steering wheel, activating the hands-free calling system. I dialed a number I had not called in over a year. Mitchell answered on the second ring. He was my oldest friend and the most ruthless corporate attorney on the East Coast. He did not say hello. He simply waited for my instruction. I looked at the road ahead, feeling a profound, chilling sense of liberation. The days of silent endurance were over. The time for the adjustment had arrived. "Mitchell," I said, my voice completely steady over the roar of the engine. "Natalie just evicted me from the property. Execute Protocol Alpha. Tear it all down." The valet at the Grand Continental Hotel did not ask for my name when I pulled the midnight blue Grand Tourer into the private underground drop-off. He simply opened the door, bowed slightly, and welcomed me back. It had been 5 years since I last stayed in the city, but true wealth leaves a lasting impression. I handed him the keys and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the entire penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the city skyline, a skyline that I had personally helped shape over a 40-year career in commercial development. I set my single leather suitcase by the door and walked to the glass. The city lights were just beginning to flicker on as the sun dipped below the horizon. The contrast was almost too sharp to comprehend. Just 3 hours ago, I was standing in a kitchen being handed a cheap cotton shirt by my own daughter, ordered to serve appetizers to venture capitalists as if I were a hired hand. Now, I stood hundreds of feet above the streets, looking down at the concrete and steel empire that actually belonged to me. They treated me like a disposable burden, completely blind to the fact that I held the foundation of their entire world in the palm of my hand. The heavy oak door of the suite clicked open behind me. Mitchell walked in carrying 2 thick leather briefcases. He did not knock, and he did not offer useless apologies for the situation. Mitchell was a man of action, a corporate attorney who had navigated hostile takeovers and billion-dollar mergers by my side for over 2 decades. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like armor, and his expression was as hard as the marble floors of the penthouse. He set the briefcases down on the massive mahogany dining table in the center of the room. He looked at me, taking in my calm demeanor, and gave a sharp, satisfied nod. He told me he had moved quickly after my phone call. The legal machinery was already waking up. I walked over to the table and took a seat opposite him. I felt a profound sense of clarity settling over me. For years, I had softened my edges, playing the quiet, grieving widower in the guest wing of that estate because I wanted peace. I had hoped that giving Natalie and Bradley space and financial security would allow them to mature into responsible adults. Instead, my leniency had bred a monstrous entitlement. Mitchell snapped the gold locks of the first briefcase open. He pulled out thick stacks of financial ledgers, bank statements, and property deeds, spreading them out across the polished wood. These were not the sanitized, basic accounts I let my daughter see. These were the master files of the trust, the holding companies, and the shell corporations that truly controlled the family assets. We started with the primary checking accounts. I told Mitchell to give me the exact numbers. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the balances. The amount of liquid capital sitting idle in those accounts was staggering. Millions of dollars generating interest, while Bradley scrambled to secure predatory loans to keep his failing consulting firm afloat. Mitchell pointed to a specific ledger detailing the monthly expenses of the estate: the landscaping, the pool maintenance, the property taxes, the premium insurance policies. Every single dime that kept the roof over their heads was automatically withdrawn from an account, completely under my control. I felt a cold, calculated energy replacing the lingering sting of my daughter betrayal. I asked Mitchell to pull the documents regarding the commercial real estate sector. Bradley loved to brag about his downtown office space, an entire floor of prime real estate with exposed brick and panoramic views. He told his friends and his investors that his brilliant business acumen allowed him to afford such luxury. The truth, sitting right there on the table in black and white, was vastly different. Mitchell slid a commercial lease agreement toward me. The building was owned by a shell corporation called Apex Holdings. I was the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings. For the past 3 years, my company had been subsidizing Bradley rent by 70%. He thought he was a self-made titan of industry, but he was nothing more than a toddler playing in a sandbox I had built and paid for. We moved on to the deed of the residential estate. The document was crisp and heavy. The name printed at the top was not Natalie, and it was certainly not Bradley. It was the Evelyn Memorial Trust. I traced my finger over my late wife's name. She had warned me shortly before she passed that Natalie was marrying a man who valued image over substance. Evelyn had urged me to protect the assets, to ensure that the wealth we built together would never be squandered by a man who did not know the meaning of hard work. I had listened to her. The trust was ironclad. Bradley had absolutely zero legal standing on that property. He was, according to the strict definition of the law, a month-to-month tenant occupying the premises at my sole discretion. Mitchell looked up from the papers, his eyes locking onto mine. He asked me how far I wanted to take this. He reminded me that with a few strokes of a pen, we could dismantle their entire reality by morning. We could cut off the cash flow, terminate the commercial lease, and initiate eviction proceedings on the estate all at once. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the glittering city lights. I thought about the contempt in my daughter's eyes when she called me a freeloader. I thought about Bradley pointing his finger in my face, threatening to throw my belongings into the street. They wanted a world where I did not exist, where my contributions were erased, and where they could claim the spoils of my lifelong labor as their own. I turned my attention back to the table and picked up a heavy silver pen. I told Mitchell we were going to take it all the way. We were not just going to teach them a lesson about gratitude. We were going to give them exactly what they asked for: total independence. We were going to sever every invisible string that kept them suspended above the harsh reality of the real world, and we were going to let gravity do the rest. Mitchell reached into the second briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of folders bound in red wire. The air in the penthouse felt distinctly colder as he spread the documents across the mahogany table. We had already established the baseline of their financial dependence, but now it was time to examine the actual mechanics of Bradley and his so-called business empire. Bradley constantly portrayed himself as a self-made tech visionary. He loved to give speeches at family gatherings about the relentless grind of entrepreneurship and the heavy burden of carrying a company entirely on his shoulders. He always made sure to look at me with a smirk when he talked about dead weight and the lack of ambition in the older generation. I sat forward and picked up the first folder. It was a comprehensive financial audit of his consulting firm, a company he arrogantly named Vanguard Solutions. Vanguard was supposed to be a cutting-edge tech advisory group, but the numbers printed on the page painted a picture of absolute financial incompetence. The revenue streams were practically non-existent. He was losing major clients faster than he could acquire new ones. The expense reports showed he was spending company funds on lavish client dinners, private golf club memberships, and luxury vehicle leases instead of paying his employees or investing in actual infrastructure. I asked Mitchell how a company bleeding this much cash managed to keep the lights on in a premium downtown commercial high-rise. Mitchell did not say a word. He simply slid a single piece of heavy parchment paper across the table and tapped the top corner. It was the commercial lease agreement for the Vanguard Solutions headquarters. I looked at the top of the page and saw the corporate logo for Apex Holdings. Apex was one of my oldest shell corporations, a silent holding company I created 20 years ago to manage discrete commercial acquisitions across the state. Bradley had absolutely no idea that his arrogant landlord, the faceless corporate entity he cursed every time the rent was due, was actually me. I read the specific terms of the lease and felt my jaw tighten with anger. The true market rate for that entire floor, with its exposed brick walls, private elevators, and panoramic city views, was $30,000 a month. According to the contract Mitchell had drafted 3 years ago under my strict instructions, Bradley was only paying $8,000 a month. For 36 consecutive months, I had been secretly subsidizing his massive ego to the tune of $22,000 every single month. That was nearly $800,000 of my own personal money burned away just so my son-in-law could pretend he was a titan of industry. I vividly remembered the time Bradley hosted an exclusive cocktail hour in that very office space. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, swirling a glass of expensive imported scotch, and loudly told his friends that true success comes only to those who refuse to take handouts. He had looked right at me when he said it, sipping a drink paid for by my hidden charity. The sheer audacity of his delusion was staggering to comprehend. But the heavily subsidized rent was only the beginning of his financial crimes against my family. Mitchell opened the final red folder. His face, usually a mask of strict professional indifference, showed genuine disgust. He told me that Bradley was not just an incompetent businessman. He was a desperate and dangerously reckless fraud. Mitchell handed me a series of urgent alerts generated by the banking security protocols I had put in place years ago to monitor the estate. Over the past 6 months, Bradley had secretly applied for 3 separate commercial bridge loans. These were not standard business loans from reputable community banks. These were high-interest, predatory loans designed to inject fast cash into failing ventures to avoid immediate bankruptcy. The private lenders required massive and tangible collateral to even consider the applications. I looked at the asset declaration forms Bradley had submitted to the brokers. My blood ran completely cold as my eyes scanned the typed words. On the line designated for collateral assets, Bradley had explicitly listed the residential estate, my estate. He had submitted altered property tax records and utility bills registered in his name, leveraging the simple fact that his mail came to the main house to create the legal illusion that he held the official title to the property. He was actively attempting to borrow $2.5 million against the exact home I built with my own 2 hands for my wife. He was willing to risk the roof over my head, the sanctuary of our family history, just to cover his miserable business failures. The depths of his betrayal went far beyond simple disrespect or rude behavior in the kitchen. He was actively attempting to steal my entire legacy through systematic and calculated financial fraud. I stared at the forged signatures at the bottom of the loan applications. He had somehow managed to copy a digital version of my signature from an old misplaced tax document, carefully tracing the curves of my name to execute his massive theft. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. Natalie had to know about this. My own daughter, the child I had protected, educated, and provided for her entire life, either knew about this massive financial fraud or was willfully turning a blind eye while her husband destroyed our family assets. They had convinced themselves that I was nothing more than an oblivious, senile old man waiting to die, a silent ghost haunting the guest wing while they plundered the vault. I placed the forged loan application gently back onto the mahogany table. I felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. The initial wave of fatherly anger was completely gone, quickly replaced by a cold and surgical precision. They had crossed the definitive line from ungrateful children to active financial criminals. If those predatory loans had been somehow approved, and Bradley inevitably defaulted on the impossible payments, the bank would have rapidly foreclosed on the estate. I would have been thrown out onto the street by armed sheriffs, losing my home and my memories, all because I chose to stay silent and keep the peace for my daughter. Mitchell watched me closely from across the table, waiting silently for my reaction. He finally asked if I wanted to involve the federal authorities and the police immediately to have Bradley arrested for wire fraud. I looked down at the forged documents and shook my head slowly. I told Mitchell that sending him to prison tonight would be far too easy and far too sudden. They needed to feel the absolute and total collapse of their manufactured reality. They needed to watch every single brick of their fake empire crumble to dust by their own hands, dollar by dollar, before the law ever got involved. I looked at Mitchell across the wide mahogany table. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to pull the trigger and begin the adjustment. Mitchell opened his laptop, and the screen illuminated his face with a pale blue glow. He navigated to the secure master banking portal that linked every subsidiary account to the main family trust. I told him to pull up the primary checking and credit accounts used by Natalie and Bradley. These were the specific accounts that funded their designer clothes, their imported groceries, their luxury car leases, and their endless stream of vanity purchases. Mitchell poised his fingers over the keyboard. He asked me if I wanted to close the accounts completely and transfer the remaining balances into my private holding company. I shook my head slowly. I told him that closing an account generates an immediate automated email from the bank. It triggers a loud fraud alert that might give them time to scramble, call their financial advisors, and prepare a fabricated narrative. Closing the accounts is like slamming a heavy door. I wanted to build an invisible glass wall. I instructed Mitchell to leave the accounts perfectly active. The massive balances should remain exactly as they were, visible to anyone who logged into the basic banking application. But I told him to access the advanced administrative controls and drop the daily spending limit to absolute zero. Mitchell stopped typing for a fraction of a second. A rare, grim smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he understood the psychological cruelty of the tactic. When a daily limit is set to zero, the physical credit card remains entirely active in the global banking system. When they attempt to buy something, the terminal will not display a message saying the account is closed. It will not say there are insufficient funds. It will simply decline the transaction. It will force them to try again. It will force them to hand over another card, and then another, standing frozen at a cash register while a growing line of impatient people watches them fail. It is a slow, deeply humiliating realization rather than a sudden, easily explained shock. Mitchell typed rapidly. The sharp clack of the keystrokes echoed in the quiet penthouse suite. He hit the enter key and confirmed the master override. The daily spending limit for my daughter personal platinum card was now zero. The limit for my son-in-law corporate expense account, an account he treated as his own personal piggy bank, was now zero. The invisible financial oxygen they had been breathing their entire adult lives was instantly and silently cut off. That was only the first surgical strike. The money was merely a tool they used to project their fake status to the world. Their true source of arrogance was the estate itself. The sprawling Connecticut mansion, with its manicured green lawns, heated swimming pools, and massive guest wing, was the crown jewel of their collective delusion. It was the physical fortress that made them feel superior and untouchable. Mitchell closed his laptop screen and reached for the final legal document inside the second leather briefcase. It was the deed transfer execution form for the Evelyn Memorial Trust. I had established this specific trust the week my wife was diagnosed with her final illness. We had sat together in the quiet hospital room, holding hands, and talked at length about what would happen to the beautiful home we built together. Evelyn loved children more than anything. She had always wanted a much larger family, but severe medical complications meant Natalie was our only child. Evelyn had made me promise that if Natalie ever proved herself unworthy of the family legacy, the house should be given to people who actually needed a safe harbor to rebuild their lives. I pulled the heavy legal document toward me. The thick parchment paper felt incredibly significant under my fingertips. Mitchell explained the strict legal parameters one last time to ensure absolute compliance with state property law. By signing this specific addendum today, I was permanently dissolving the standard residential family trust and converting the entire estate into an irrevocable charitable donation. The designated beneficiary was a highly respected registered nonprofit organization that provided transitional housing, legal defense, and job training for single mothers escaping abusive domestic situations. Once the ink dried on this final page, the transfer was absolute and legally binding. Not even I could reverse the decision if I changed my mind tomorrow. The property would belong entirely to the charity board of directors. Bradley and Natalie would be instantly transformed from the wealthy lords of the manor into unlawful squatters occupying private property owned by a domestic violence shelter. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I did not hesitate for a single second. I thought about the sheer, dripping contempt in my daughter's voice when she told me I had outlived my usefulness. I thought about the absolute lack of respect she showed for the man who gave her every possible advantage in life. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name with a strong, steady hand. The signature was large and deliberate. I pushed the document back across the polished table to Mitchell. He took out his official heavy metal notary stamp, pressed it firmly onto the bottom of the page, and signed his own name as the legal state witness. The loud thud of the metal stamp hitting the wood table sounded exactly like a judge gavel falling in a silent courtroom. The verdict was final. The sentence was passed. The trap was now fully armed and completely invisible. The financial ledgers were locked tight. The bank limits were zeroed out. The deed to the sprawling estate was legally transferred out of their reach forever. I stood up from the heavy chair and walked back over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was a massive, sprawling network of bright lights and constant movement, completely unaware of the absolute financial devastation I had just unleashed upon two of its most arrogant residents. It was late in the evening now. Natalie and Bradley were likely still at the dark house, screaming at each other and dealing with the miserable fallout of their ruined dinner party. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the very hardwood floorboards beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise, and they would step out into a world that had fundamentally shifted on its axis. The massive financial safety net they took for granted was gone, replaced by a cold concrete floor they were about to hit at terminal velocity. I took a deep, calming breath of the cool, conditioned air in the penthouse. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Tomorrow morning, Natalie was going to try and buy her way out of the heavy guilt from the disastrous dinner party by purchasing a wildly expensive apology gift. Tomorrow morning, the first invisible wire would snap, and the real consequences would finally begin. The morning sun poured through the glass walls of my hotel suite, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I sat in a deep leather armchair, with my laptop open on the coffee table in front of me. I had a direct view of the secure banking portal Mitchell had configured the night before. I knew my daughter better than she knew herself. I knew exactly how she operated under pressure. I knew that after the catastrophic failure of the dinner party, her immediate instinct would not be to apologize to her husband with genuine, thoughtful words. Her instinct, conditioned by years of unlimited access to my money, would be to purchase his forgiveness. She believed with absolute certainty that a shiny enough object could patch any hole in her crumbling marriage. I watched the digital clock on my laptop screen click over to 10 in the morning. The luxury boutiques in the affluent downtown shopping district were just opening their heavy doors to the public. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee and waited for the silent trap to spring. Miles away from my quiet penthouse, Natalie walked into the most exclusive jeweler in the city. I received the exact details of this encounter later that same afternoon from the store manager, a discreet man who had done business with my late wife for over 2 decades. Natalie pushed through the heavy glass doors wearing her designer sunglasses indoors, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth and extreme impatience. The boutique was dead silent, smelling of expensive leather and polished glass. She did not browse the aisles. She walked directly to the back counter displaying imported Swiss watches. She demanded the immediate attention of the senior sales associate, snapping her fingers to pull him away from organizing a velvet display case. She wanted to buy a specific diver watch for Bradley, a heavy stainless steel timepiece with a navy blue dial that retailed for exactly $4,200. She told the associate it was a small token to smooth over a stressful week, laughing loudly as if dropping $4,000 on a Tuesday morning was a tedious chore she just wanted to get over with. The associate was perfectly trained to cater to the extreme egos of the wealthy. He smiled politely and retrieved the heavy watch from the locked case. He placed it carefully on a padded leather tray for her inspection. Natalie barely looked at the craftsmanship. She was entirely focused on the performance of buying it. She reached into her imported handbag and pulled out her personal platinum credit card. This was the exact same card linked to the account Mitchell and I had restricted just 12 hours prior. She placed the heavy metal card onto the glass counter with a sharp, deliberate clack. She looked around the boutique, making sure the 2 other customers in the store had noticed the distinct sound of premium metal hitting the glass. She was buying an audience just as much as she was buying a watch to pacify her angry husband. The associate picked up the card, complimented her excellent choice of gift, and inserted it into the discreet digital terminal behind the counter. He punched in the purchase amount and waited for the banking system to approve the transaction. A small red light blinked on the screen. The machine emitted a soft, negative beep. The associate frowned slightly. He pulled the card out, polished the gold chip on his sleeve, and inserted it a second time. The machine beeped again. A short text message appeared on the screen indicating that the transaction was completely declined. The associate looked up at Natalie. He kept his voice low and respectful, professionally trained to handle moments of financial embarrassment with extreme discretion. He leaned forward and quietly informed her that the card was not going through. He kindly suggested it might simply be an automated security hold due to the unusually high purchase amount. Natalie did not react with grace or understanding. She reacted with loud, defensive indignation. She scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically, and told the associate his machine must be broken. She loudly declared that she had spent twice that amount on custom shoes just last week without any issue at all. The other customers in the quiet boutique turned their heads to look at the sudden commotion. The associate offered to call her bank to manually authorize the purchase. Natalie snatched the platinum card out of his hand, her face flushing with a mixture of sudden anger and creeping embarrassment. She told him not to bother calling her personal bank because she absolutely did not have time to wait on hold for a customer service representative. She dug frantically back into her purse and pulled out a second card. It was the sleek silver corporate expense card issued to Vanguard Solutions. Bradley strictly used this card to fund his fake business empire, but the core account was ultimately tethered to my master trust. She slapped the corporate card onto the counter, demanding the associate run it immediately so she could leave. The associate remained perfectly calm under her verbal assault. He picked up the silver card and processed it through the terminal. The silence in the boutique was now thick and suffocating. Natalie tapped her manicured nails impatiently against the glass display case, staring down the associate as if her sheer willpower could force the transaction to approve. The terminal processed the network request. The red light blinked again. The soft, negative beep echoed clearly through the quiet room. The associate looked at the screen, then slowly looked back up at my daughter. He slid the corporate card across the glass toward her. He apologized deeply and stated clearly that this second card had also been completely declined by the issuer. The absolute reality of the situation crashed down on Natalie in front of a live audience of her wealthy peers. There was no security hold. There was no broken machine. Her infinite well of money had suddenly and inexplicably run completely dry. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She stared at the two useless pieces of plastic resting on the glass counter. The other customers were no longer trying to hide their stares. They were watching a woman who had walked in acting like royalty suddenly get exposed as a complete fraud. Natalie could not scream at the associate. She could not throw a tantrum without confirming her total humiliation. She hastily shoved the cards back into her bag, her face burning a deep, bright red. She mumbled something completely incoherent about her husband mixing up the corporate account numbers. She turned around and practically ran out of the boutique, pushing the heavy glass doors open and fleeing blindly into the busy street. Back in my penthouse, a small notification pinged loudly on my laptop screen. It was an automated alert from the master banking portal. It showed 2 consecutive declined transactions at a premium jewelry store. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The invisible wall had held strong. The first massive crack in their perfect reality had just split wide open, and the true panic was finally about to begin. I walked out of the Grand Continental Hotel at 8 in the morning. The air was crisp and the city was completely alive with the morning commute. I did not stay in the penthouse today. I wanted a front row seat to the exact moment Bradley realized his empire was nothing but an illusion. I walked 3 blocks down the busy avenue until I reached the towering glass structure that housed Vanguard Solutions. I crossed the street and took a seat at a small outdoor cafe directly opposite the main entrance. I ordered a black coffee and watched the heavy revolving doors. Mitchell had sent me a secure link on my phone, granting me live access to the security cameras installed on Bradley's floor. I placed my phone flat on the cafe table, dividing my attention between the street level and the digital feed. I knew Bradley's schedule perfectly. He always arrived exactly at 8:30, making sure the lobby was full of other executives so they could see him walk into the private elevator. Right on time, his silver Porsche aggressively pulled into the loading zone. He tossed the keys to the building valet without even looking the man in the eye. He wore a sharp navy suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably held nothing more than golf magazines and empty folders. He was radiating a toxic mix of arrogance and barely suppressed rage. I knew he and Natalie must have fought bitterly the night before over the humiliated display at the jewelry boutique. He strode through the revolving glass doors, completely oblivious to the fact that I was sitting less than 50 feet away, watching his final moments of manufactured dignity. I looked down at the screen of my phone. The live video feed showed the private elevator doors opening on the 20th floor. Bradley stepped out, adjusting his tie, ready to bark orders at his receptionist. He took 2 steps forward and froze completely solid. The heavy, custom-frosted glass doors bearing his company logo were shut tight. Wrapped tightly around the brushed steel handles was a thick industrial metal chain, secured by a massive brass padlock. He stood there for several long seconds, his brain completely failing to process the visual information. This was a premium corporate environment, a place of refined elegance. Chains and padlocks belonged on abandoned warehouses, not the glass doors of his multi-million-dollar consulting firm. He stepped closer to the glass and saw the document taped to the center of the door at eye level. It was a bright, neon orange legal notice that stood out violently against the sleek corporate decor. The heading printed in bold black letters was a formal notice of commercial eviction and immediate asset seizure. I watched through the camera as he read the words. Mitchell had drafted the document with absolute, merciless precision. It detailed the immediate termination of his heavily subsidized lease agreement. It explicitly stated that the holding company was adjusting the required rent to the true market value of $30,000 a month, effective immediately, due to a breach of the good faith clauses embedded in the original contract. It demanded the immediate payment of the adjusted balance or the total forfeiture of the leased space. Bradley pulled his keycard from his pocket with shaking hands. He swiped it against the security reader mounted on the wall. A small red light flashed, followed by a harsh buzzing sound. His access had been digitally completely revoked at midnight. He swiped it again, faster and harder, as if physical force could override a frozen computer system. The light remained stubbornly red. I watched his posture shift from confusion to absolute, terrifying panic. He began to pound his heavy fist against the frosted glass. He was not just locked out of a fancy office space. He was locked out of his entire operational hub. Inside those walls were the expensive network servers that held every single piece of data his company possessed. The client contracts, the financial records, the proprietary software he claimed to have developed. All of it was sitting behind a locked door owned by an entity he could not fight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed the property management office. The building manager, a stern professional who had worked for me for 15 years, answered immediately. I knew exactly what the manager was telling him because I had written the script myself. The manager calmly explained that Apex Holdings had exercised its legal right to seize all physical assets left inside the premises to cover the projected financial losses of the broken lease. Bradley was informed that he could not remove a single computer, a single file, or even his expensive imported espresso machine until the $30,000 balance was paid in full via a certified bank check. Bradley began to yell into his phone. He paced frantically back and forth in the narrow elevator lobby. Other executives from neighboring offices stepped off the adjacent elevators, stopping in their tracks to watch a grown man lose his mind in the middle of a professional hallway. They saw the heavy chains. They saw the neon orange eviction notice. They saw the absolute desperation radiating from a man who had spent the last 3 years talking down to all of them. The public humiliation was total and inescapable. Bradley realized he was making a scene and abruptly ended the phone call. He stood alone in the hallway, breathing heavily, staring at the locked doors of his ruined company. He needed money. He needed a massive amount of liquid cash right this very second to hire a ruthless corporate attorney to file an injunction against the holding company. He needed to get his servers back before his remaining clients realized his firm had effectively ceased to exist overnight. I watched him turn around and practically sprint back into the elevator. The feed cut to the lobby camera. He bolted past the security desk, ignoring the confused stares of the building staff. He burst through the revolving doors and ran out onto the street. He yelled at the valet to bring his car back immediately. I sat quietly at my cafe table, taking another slow sip of my coffee. I watched him throw himself into the driver's seat of his sports car and speed recklessly into the morning traffic. He was heading straight back to the residential estate. He was going back to confront Natalie, completely convinced that her ridiculous spending habits had somehow triggered a freeze on their accounts and caused this massive financial catastrophe. He was going back to the house to demand she fix the problem, completely unaware that the house itself was no longer theirs to claim. The second wire had just violently snapped, and the trap was closing tighter around them with every single mile he drove. I closed the live video feed of the downtown office building on my phone. The public show on the street was over, and it was time to switch channels. I opened my laptop on the small cafe table and logged securely into the comprehensive security network I had installed at the Connecticut estate 5 years ago. I had originally put the cameras in place to protect my late wife when her health began to rapidly fail, ensuring she was always safe if I had to step out of the room. Now, those same high-definition lenses served a completely different purpose. They were my private front-row seats to the absolute collapse of a toxic marriage. I clicked on the feed for the main kitchen. The room was massive, all white marble and imported stainless steel, designed to look perfect for a magazine cover rather than to serve an actual family. Natalie was pacing aggressively back and forth across the polished floor. She was still wearing the designer outfit from her disastrous morning trip to the jewelry boutique, but her perfectly maintained posture was completely gone. She held a large crystal glass of white wine in a shaking hand, taking heavy gulps as she paced. She looked entirely unhinged, like a queen who had just been banished from her own kingdom. The exterior driveway camera captured Bradley pulling his silver sports car violently through the wrought iron gates. He did not bother to park inside the spacious garage. He slammed on the brakes, leaving the car at a crooked angle right in front of the main concrete steps. He burst through the heavy front doors, moving with the chaotic, destructive energy of a cornered animal. The interior audio feed picked up the heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes stomping down the long hallway. He turned the corner and entered the kitchen. He did not greet his wife. He did not ask her what was wrong or why she was drinking wine before noon. He immediately launched into a vicious, unhinged verbal assault. His face was twisted in absolute fury. He pointed his finger directly at Natalie and screamed that she had finally done it. He accused her of completely draining their primary bank accounts with her mindless, pathetic shopping addiction. He yelled at the top of his lungs that because of her reckless spending, his commercial lease payment had bounced. He had been publicly evicted, and he was currently locked out of his own company headquarters. Natalie stopped pacing instantly. The sheer shock on her face quickly hardened into a vicious, defensive rage. She slammed her wineglass down onto the marble island so hard I was genuinely surprised the crystal stem did not shatter into pieces. She screamed back at him with equal terrifying ferocity. She told him he was a complete idiot. She confessed that she had just suffered the most humiliating experience of her entire life at the jewelry boutique because both of her credit cards had been declined in front of the entire store. But she absolutely did not take the blame. Instead, she threw it right back in his face. She accused him of running his consulting firm straight into the ground. She yelled that he had obviously maxed out the corporate accounts to cover his massive, embarrassing business debts and left her with absolutely nothing to pay for their daily expenses. For the past 3 years, these two people had maintained a carefully constructed, bulletproof illusion of a perfect power couple. They smiled constantly for the cameras at charity galas and bragged loudly to their friends about their immense success and deep love for one another. Now, completely stripped of the financial padding that kept them comfortable, the ugly truth of their relationship bled out onto the kitchen floor. Bradley stepped closer to her, his voice dropping into a register that dripped with absolute venom. He told her she was nothing but a spoiled, useless brat who had never worked a single day in her life. He explicitly said the only reason he even put up with her constant nagging and shallow obsessions was because her family had money. Natalie laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound that echoed coldly in the large room. She fired right back, telling him he was a pathetic failure playing dress-up as a chief executive. She said everyone in their elite social circle knew his tech firm was a complete joke, and the only reason he had any status at all was because he managed to marry into her inheritance. They were ruthlessly tearing each other apart, using every intimate insecurity they knew to inflict maximum emotional damage. It was a spectacular display of mutual destruction. They yelled about the leased luxury cars, the massive unpaid credit bills, and the fake vacations they took just to post pictures online. But then, right in the middle of the screaming match, the momentum suddenly shifted. Bradley stopped pacing. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up completely. He looked at Natalie, his chest heaving, and told her that the commercial lease payment was processed through a completely separate holding company, not their primary checking account. He said there was absolutely no mathematical way her personal shopping habits could have triggered a commercial eviction notice from his corporate landlord. Natalie stared at him. the heavy fog of her defensive anger slowly lifting to reveal a sharp, terrifying realization. She told him that the bank associate at the boutique did not say the account was empty. The associate said the cards were explicitly declined and restricted by the primary issuer. They stood there in the silent kitchen, looking at each other as the chaotic pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together. They had both assumed the other was responsible for the financial collapse, but the math simply did not add up. A failing consulting firm does not immediately zero out a personal platinum card. A shopping addiction does not lock down a corporate server room in the middle of the night. There was only one entity on the entire planet with the power, the access, and the legal authority to systematically dismantle their entire financial structure in a single morning. I watched the exact moment the absolute truth hit them. It was written clearly across both of their faces. The aggressive, screaming anger melted away entirely, replaced by a creeping, suffocating dread. Bradley looked slowly toward the long hallway that led to the east guest wing. Natalie covered her mouth with her trembling hand. They finally understood. The quiet, grieving old man they had treated like a worthless servant had not just left the house. He had taken their entire world with him. Natalie whispered my name, her voice shaking with a sudden, overwhelming terror. I reached out and calmly closed the laptop. The argument was over. The panic had officially set in. The silence in the kitchen was heavy and absolute. The crushing realization that I was the unseen architect of their sudden downfall had just struck them both. But before their minds could even fully process the terrifying magnitude of what that meant, a new sound violently shattered the quiet morning of the affluent neighborhood. The deep, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines echoed up the long, winding driveway of the estate. The flashing amber lights cast long, frantic shadows across the perfectly manicured green lawn. The golden reflection of the rotating lights spilled through the massive kitchen windows, illuminating their pale faces with a sickening, urgent glow. I sat comfortably in the cafe downtown, watching the live security feed on my laptop screen. The two massive industrial tow trucks backing slowly past the wrought iron gates were not there by accident. I had scheduled this specific asset recovery the previous night, timing their arrival perfectly to coincide with Bradley returning home in his panicked state. I wanted him to experience every single loss in rapid succession, granting him absolutely no time to breathe or formulate a lie. Bradley loved that silver sports car more than he loved his own wife. He spent every weekend polishing it in the driveway, making sure anyone who drove past the estate knew he was a man of immense success. Natalie treated her imported luxury SUV like a royal carriage, using it to intimidate the other mothers at the local private schools. They paraded these vehicles around town as undeniable proof of their elite status. But like everything else in their lives, the cars were built on a foundation of lies and my silent charity. I had purchased both vehicles through my commercial holding company to secure a better tax rate, allowing them to drive the cars under a corporate lease agreement. They had stopped making those token lease payments to me 6 months ago. I had let it slide at the time, filing away the breach of contract for the exact moment I would need it. That moment was right now. Bradley ran to the front windows, his face pressing hard against the expensive glass. He saw the massive trucks angling themselves directly toward his prized vehicles parked carelessly in the circular driveway. His initial terror at discovering my involvement instantly morphed back into blinding, arrogant rage. He still desperately believed he had some semblance of power left to wield in this world. He threw open the heavy wooden front doors and marched out onto the sweeping concrete steps. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding the drivers shut off their engines and leave his private property immediately. He threatened to call the police. He threatened to sue their towing company into absolute bankruptcy. He waved his arms wildly, looking exactly like a madman standing on the lawn of an estate that had already completely rejected him. Natalie followed closely behind him, clutching her silk robe tightly around her waist. Her eyes were wide with fresh, unimaginable humiliation as the loud commotion began to draw the immediate attention of their wealthy neighbors. In a neighborhood where silence and discretion were the ultimate currencies, screaming on the front lawn was an unforgivable social sin. Doors down the street were opening. People were stepping out onto their expansive porches, holding their morning coffees, stopping to watch the spectacular collapse of the couple who always looked down on everyone else. Natalie tried to hide behind the large stone pillar of the porch, unable to look her peers in the eye. The lead tow truck driver was a broad, weathered man who looked entirely unimpressed by Bradley and his expensive tailored suit. He stepped down heavily from the cab of his truck, wearing a bright yellow safety vest, and walked casually toward the frantic man screaming directly in his face. He held a heavy metal clipboard in his thick hands. He did not yell back. He did not look intimidated. He calmly asked if he was speaking to Bradley. Bradley puffed out his chest, his face red with exertion, and loudly declared that he was the owner of the vehicles and the owner of the entire property, and that this was a massive, highly illegal mistake. The driver simply flipped a page on his clipboard, sighed heavily, and shook his head. He spoke loudly enough for the exterior audio feed to pick up every single devastating word. He told Bradley that he was absolutely not the owner of either vehicle. He read the registration details aloud for everyone, including the listening neighbors, to hear clearly. Both the silver sports car and the luxury SUV were legally registered to a corporate entity known as Apex Holdings, the exact same company that had just evicted Bradley from his downtown office space an hour ago. The driver explained in a slow, deliberate tone that the corporate leases on both vehicles had been officially terminated for gross financial misconduct and severe delinquency. He handed Bradley a thick stack of legal repossession orders. Bradley snatched the papers, his eyes darting frantically across the typed pages. He saw my corporate logo right at the top. He saw the exact vehicle identification numbers. He saw the undeniable legal authority that stripped him of his prized possessions. The fight instantly drained out of him. He desperately tried to negotiate. He reached into his pocket and offered the driver cash, begging him to just give him 24 hours to sort out the massive bank error. The driver laughed a short, humorless laugh. He told Bradley he did not take bribes from people whose credit cards were currently bouncing across the entire city. It was a brutal, perfect comment that completely shattered whatever pride Bradley had left. The driver turned his back on him, signaled to his partner, and engaged the heavy hydraulic lifts. Bradley tried to step behind his car to physically block the metal hooks, but the second driver warned him that state troopers were already on standby to arrest him for interfering with illegal corporate asset recovery. Defeated, broken, and completely out of options, Bradley backed away slowly. He walked back to the concrete steps and stood next to his wife. They stood completely frozen side by side. They watched in absolute, agonizing silence as the thick steel hooks secured the axles of their luxurious vehicles. The hydraulic arms whined loudly, lifting the heavy cars effortlessly into the air. Within 10 short minutes, the entire mechanical process was complete. The two large tow trucks shifted into gear and rolled heavily down the driveway, taking the very last visible symbols of their fake wealth away with them. The exhaust smoke cleared, leaving the massive circular driveway completely empty. They were now completely stranded on an estate they did not own, with bank accounts they could not use, and careers that no longer existed. The physical reality of their absolute lack of ownership was now undeniably visible to the entire world. The heavy silence that fell over the estate after the tow trucks departed was absolutely suffocating. I watched the security feed as Natalie and Bradley stood frozen on the sweeping concrete steps of the grand house. The circular driveway, once a proud display of their leased luxury vehicles, was now completely empty. The physical void mirrored the sudden terrifying emptiness of their bank accounts. Their wealthy neighbors slowly retreated into their own homes, closing their heavy front doors, and leaving my daughter and her husband standing alone in the cold morning air. The spectacle was over. The harsh reality of survival was just beginning. Natalie turned slowly and walked back into the massive foyer of the house. The click of her expensive heels echoed sharply against the imported marble floors. The house, which had always felt like a grand palace of endless privilege, suddenly felt like a massive, echoing tomb. She walked past the sweeping grand staircase and into the formal study. She was desperate for some kind of rational explanation. She needed to find a mistake, a clerical error, anything that would prove her entire life was not collapsing around her. She walked over to the mahogany console table where the household staff usually placed the Daily Mail. She picked up a thick stack of envelopes that had been delivered the previous afternoon. Her hands were still visibly shaking from the public humiliation on the front lawn. She sorted through the glossy magazines and the heavy cardstock invitations to charity galas they could no longer afford to attend. Near the bottom of the stack, she found 3 standard white envelopes with bold red lettering printed across the front. They were from the primary utility companies that serviced the massive estate: the water department, the regional electric grid, and the natural gas provider. Natalie ripped the first envelope open. Her eyes darted rapidly across the printed page. It was a formal notice of immediate service disconnection. The letter stated clearly that the account holder had officially requested a total cessation of services at this specific address. The second letter from the electric company said exactly the same thing. Services were scheduled to be completely shut off in exactly 48 hours. Natalie dropped the papers onto the polished wooden table. She leaned heavily against the console, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. The final piece of the puzzle finally clicked violently into place inside her mind. The boutique associate had told her the credit cards were restricted by the primary issuer. The tow truck driver had shown them corporate recovery documents signed by Apex Holdings. And now the utility companies were turning off the power based on the direct orders of the master account holder. She looked at the name printed at the top of the utility bills. It was not her name. It was not the name of her husband. It was my name. Vincent, the quiet, invisible old man she had ordered to serve appetizers to her guests just 24 hours ago. I watched through the camera as the sheer magnitude of her fatal error washed over her. She realized that I had not just packed a single suitcase and walked away in defeat. She realized I was an apex predator who had spent years silently building the very cage she was currently standing in. I had handed her the keys to a kingdom she never earned, and the moment she disrespected me, I simply changed the locks. A deep, primal panic set in. She grabbed her phone from her pocket and frantically pulled up my contact information. She pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear. I sat in my quiet hotel room miles away and watched my own phone light up on the coffee table. I let it ring. I watched her pacing in the study, biting her lip, waiting for a voice she was never going to hear again. The call rolled over to voicemail. She tried again and again. I simply watched the screen, feeling absolutely nothing but cold resolve. Bradley suddenly stormed into the study, breaking her frantic cycle of phone calls. He was pacing with a manic, desperate energy. He refused to accept that he had been completely bested. His massive ego simply would not allow his brain to process the reality of total defeat. He ran his hands through his hair and loudly declared that this was nothing but a temporary cash flow problem caused by a vindictive old man. He told Natalie to stop crying and stop calling me. He said they did not need my money, and they certainly did not need my permission to survive. He walked over to the large window overlooking the expansive back gardens. He spread his arms wide and told her they were standing inside a gold mine. He confidently stated that the estate was worth at least $6 million on the open market. He declared his brilliant new strategy. He was going to go directly to the largest commercial bank in the city, owned. He was going to use the massive equity in the residential estate to secure a multi-million-dollar emergency bridge loan. He planned to use that fresh cash to pay off his commercial lease recover. His seized servers buy back their repossessed cars and completely sever all financial ties with me forever. Natalie looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. She desperately wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her strong, intelligent husband had a master plan to save them from this nightmare. She nodded slowly, clinging to his arrogant delusion like a life raft in a violent storm. She told him to go to the bank immediately and fix this massive mess before the power was shut off. Bradley pulled out his phone and angrily ordered a premium ride-share car, cursing loudly about the indignity of having to use an application to get around his own neighborhood. He adjusted his expensive tie, completely blind, to the absolute disaster waiting for him. He thought he was walking into a bank to leverage a $6 million asset. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking into a federal trap. He had no idea that the very house he was trying to mortgage currently belonged to a charity organization for battered women. I watched him march confidently out the front door, stepping into the back of a black sedan. He was driving straight toward the final devastating humiliation, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I tracked the premium rideshare vehicle through the global positioning system tracker Mitchell had discreetly embedded in the corporate phone plan years ago. Bradley was heading straight into the heart of the financial district. His destination was the grand marble building of the primary commercial bank in the city. This was an institution that catered specifically to high-net-worth individuals and corporate accounts. Bradley had always loved walking through those massive brass doors because the opulent environment validated his inflated sense of self-importance. He genuinely believed that wearing a tailored suit and carrying an expensive leather briefcase made him an equal to the titans of industry who actually held real capital in those secure vaults. I sat quietly in my hotel suite, sipping my black coffee, and waited for Mitchell to relay the inevitable outcome. Mitchell had a highly placed contact inside the bank. The contact was a senior vice president who personally handled the blind trust accounts for all my holding companies. I knew with absolute certainty that I would receive a detailed account of every single humiliating second of this encounter. According to the comprehensive report I received later that afternoon, Bradley strutted into the massive bank lobby, acting as if he owned the entire building. He completely bypassed the standard teller lines and demanded an immediate audience with a senior commercial loan officer. He loudly claimed to the reception staff that he was a major corporate client facing a minor liquidity issue that required immediate attention. He was eventually escorted into the glass-walled office of a meticulous and highly experienced loan officer named Mr. Stanton. Bradley did not sit down with the humility of a man whose cars had just been towed and whose business had just been padlocked. He sat down with the aggressive, entitled posture of a billionaire demanding a routine favor from a subordinate. He opened his empty leather briefcase and pulled out the forged property tax documents he had prepared the night before. He confidently slid the crisp papers across the polished mahogany desk. He told Stanton he required an emergency bridge loan of exactly $3 million to facilitate a massive corporate expansion for his tech consulting firm. He waved his hand dismissively and stated that he would graciously allow the bank to use his $6 million Connecticut estate as collateral for the transaction. Stanton was a veteran of the banking industry who had seen every type of fraud imaginable. He did not care about designer suits or loud, arrogant voices. He cared exclusively about verified numbers and legal documentation. He picked up the tax records Bradley had provided and adjusted his reading glasses. He politely asked Bradley to wait for a few moments while he pulled up the official county registry to verify the property deeds before they could discuss the specific interest rates of the bridge loan. Bradley leaned back heavily in his leather chair, crossing his legs and checking his expensive gold watch. He acted utterly bored by the procedural delay. He actually had the audacity to ask Stanton to hurry the process along because he had a very important lunch meeting to attend in an hour. Stanton simply nodded and began typing rapidly on his computer keyboard. The glass office was perfectly quiet, except for the steady clicking of the keys. Stanton accessed the secure municipal database that recorded every single real estate transaction in the entire state. He cross-referenced the address of the massive residential estate with the name sitting across from him. He stopped typing entirely. He looked at the glowing computer screen, and then he looked back at the forged tax documents resting on his desk. Stanton frowned slightly as a look of deep professional concern crossed his features. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers together on the desk. He asked Bradley to clearly define his exact relationship to the property listed on the loan application. Bradley scoffed loudly, clearly offended that a bank employee would question his authority. He puffed out his chest and stated in a highly condescending tone that he was the sole owner and master of the house, having inherited the sprawling property through his wife after her mother passed away. He demanded to know why Stanton was wasting his valuable time with such stupid, meaningless questions. Stanton did not raise his voice or react to the blatant insult. He simply turned his large computer monitor around so Bradley could clearly see the screen for himself. He pointed a steady finger at the official legal registration of the estate. Stanton explained in a calm, clinical voice that according to the supreme legal authority of the state, Bradley did not own a single blade of grass on that property. He stated clearly and without any hesitation that the estate was not registered to Bradley, and it was certainly not registered to Natalie. Stanton read the official legal designation aloud for absolute clarity. The property was legally owned in its entirety by the Evelyn Memorial Trust. He explained that this was a highly restrictive blind trust, completely insulated from any outside claims or financial leverage. Bradley stared at the glowing screen as his arrogant sneer slowly melted into an expression of absolute horrified confusion. He opened his mouth to argue and scream about clerical errors and incompetent government employees, just like he had done on the front lawn with the tow truck driver. But Stanton cut him off before he could even utter a single desperate word. Stanton tapped a specific line on the digital document displayed on the monitor. He informed Bradley that not only did he lack any equity whatsoever to leverage for a loan, but his official legal status regarding the residential property was listed strictly as a month-to-month tenant. Stanton looked Bradley dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow to his massive ego. He said the bank could not offer a $3 million commercial bridge loan to a man whose only verified asset was a temporary permission to sleep in a guest bedroom. The absolute reality of his complete financial impotence finally broke through the thick skull of my son-in-law. He had walked into the commercial bank truly believing he was a titan of industry, ready to leverage his massive wealth to save his fake empire. He was now being told by a senior financial official that he was effectively a homeless man begging for an impossible handout. The glass walls of the office suddenly felt like a suffocating, transparent cage. He realized that the wealthy executives walking past the office out in the lobby could clearly see him being utterly rejected and humiliated. The blinding panic he had tried so hard to suppress back at the house violently returned to his chest. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed backward into the glass wall with a loud thud. He snatched his forged documents off the desk, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He did not say a single word in his defense. He could not defend himself against the cold, hard facts displayed on the government registry. He turned around and practically ran out of the office. He fled across the grand marble lobby, pushing past the armed security guards and bursting out into the busy city street. He was completely out of options. The house was not his to sell. The cars were gone. The business was padlocked shut. He was a man drowning in an ocean of his own arrogance with absolutely no life raft in sight. The afternoon sun hung low over the city skyline, casting long golden shadows across the private balcony of my penthouse suite. I sat in a comfortable wicker chair, holding a glass of iced tea. The air was warm and peaceful, but the glass coffee table in front of me told a completely different story. My cellular phone sat perfectly in the center of the table. It had not stopped vibrating, and lighting up for the past 3 hours. It was a digital manifestation of the absolute chaos I had unleashed upon my daughter and her husband. I did not reach for the device. I simply watched the screen illuminate time and time again, documenting their rapid descent from arrogance to absolute terror. The digital onslaught had begun precisely at 1:15 in the afternoon, right after Bradley fled the commercial bank in total disgrace. The first sequence of messages came directly from his number. They were not apologies. They were demands. At 1:20, he sent a text message ordering me to pick up the phone immediately and explain the massive misunderstanding with the bank registry. At 1:35, his tone shifted from demanding to overtly threatening. He typed in all capital letters stating that he was hiring a team of aggressive lawyers to sue me for illegal eviction and breach of contract. He promised he would take every single penny I owned and leave me rotting in a state facility. I read the words as they flashed across the screen and took a slow sip of my iced tea. A man who cannot afford to keep the lights on in his own house certainly cannot afford a team of corporate attorneys. I let the phone vibrate and go to voicemail. By 2:45, the reality of their situation had clearly set in, and the angry messages from Bradley stopped entirely. A heavy silence fell over the phone for about 20 minutes. They were likely sitting in the dark, empty house, realizing that all of Bradley and his empty threats meant absolutely nothing against the ironclad legal structures I had put in place. Then the screen lit up again. This time it was Natalie. The shift in tone was immediate and pathetic. At 3:10, she sent a long paragraph asking where I was and saying that they needed to talk like a civilized family. She said she knew I was upset, but this was going too far. I simply watched the notification fade away. At 3:30, she sent another message. This one was much shorter and lacked any of her usual entitled confidence. She asked if I was the one who canceled the utility accounts. She said the house was getting cold and they did not have any cash to order food. I watched the timestamp change to 4 o'clock. The space between the messages grew shorter, and the panic radiating from the text became palpable. She called 5 times in a row. I watched my own daughter face flash on the caller identification screen over and over again. The picture she had chosen for her contact profile was from a charity gala I had paid for, where she was wearing a diamond necklace I had bought her. The irony was not lost on me. When the calls went to the automated voicemail, she resorted back to text messages. The automated transcription feature on my phone displayed her frantic words right on the locked screen. At 4:15, she typed a message saying Bradley was having a panic attack in the living room. She said they had tried to use their emergency credit cards to book a hotel room, but every single transaction was declined by the issuer. She begged me to transfer just $500 so they could get a warm room and a meal. At 4:30, she begged me to just answer the phone. She said she was sorry for what happened in the kitchen the day before. She typed that she did not mean the things she said, and that she just wanted her dad to come home and fix everything. It was a carefully crafted manipulation. She was not sorry for treating me like a disposable servant. She was only sorry that the servant had taken the massive bank vault with him when he left. If I had answered that phone and offered them a lifeline, they would have spent exactly 1 week acting grateful before reverting right back to their old toxic behavior. Evelyn and I had raised her to be strong and independent. We had given her the best education money could buy, but we had also shielded her from failure. We had created a monster of entitlement. They needed to feel the absolute bottom before they could ever hope to climb back up. I refused to be their financial safety net any longer. I leaned back in my chair and watched the red notification bubble on the messaging application climb higher and higher. 30 missed calls, 40 missed calls. By 5:30 in the evening, the phone had reached exactly 50 missed calls. 50 desperate attempts to reach the man they had ordered out of his own home just 24 hours prior. The battery on the device was slowly draining from the constant activity. The final message of the evening arrived at 5:45. It was from Natalie. It contained only 3 simple words. Please help us. I stared at those 3 words for a very long time. As a father, my deepest instinct had always been to protect my child from the harsh realities of the world. I remembered holding her when she was a little girl, promising her I would always keep her safe. But I finally understood that protecting her from the consequences of her own terrible choices was not love. It was enablement. Allowing her to treat me with such profound disrespect was a failure on my part. Correcting that failure required absolute, unbreakable silence. I reached out and finally picked up the heavy phone from the glass table. I did not reply to the message. I did not listen to the dozens of frantic voicemails they had left. I simply opened the settings menu and turned the device completely off. The screen went permanently black. The vibrating ceased. The absolute silence of the penthouse balcony was finally restored. I stood up and walked to the edge of the glass railing, looking out over the sprawling city. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple as the evening set in. Tomorrow morning, they were going to face the final and most devastating blow of the entire adjustment. They had spent the entire day losing their cars, their business, and their money. But tomorrow, they were going to lose the very ground beneath their feet. I turned away from the city lights and walked back inside the suite to prepare for the end. I remained in my hotel suite as the city lights sparkled brilliantly against the night sky. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly. It was a typical bitter chill for a late autumn evening in Connecticut. I opened my laptop one final time for the evening. The security cameras at the estate were wired to an independent backup battery system designed to run for exactly 2 hours after a main grid failure. I wanted to witness the exact moment the final pillars of their artificial world collapsed. The camera feeds loaded on my screen. The house looked like a mausoleum. The grand chandeliers were still burning brightly, wasting electricity they could no longer afford. Natalie and Bradley were sitting in the living room. They were not speaking to each other. They were sitting on opposite ends of the massive imported Italian leather sofa, completely defeated by the events of the day. They had no cars in the driveway. They had no money in their accounts. But they still had the illusion of shelter. That final illusion was about to evaporate. Natalie stood up. She looked completely exhausted, her carefully maintained appearance ruined by hours of crying and panic. She walked out of the living room and headed toward the master bathroom. She needed to wash her face. She needed to feel some semblance of normalcy. I switched the camera view to the upstairs hallway. I watched her enter the bathroom. A moment later, the audio feed picked up a harsh metallic groaning sound, echoing through the walls. It was the sound of the massive industrial water pumps in the basement violently shutting down. The municipal water company had executed the termination order. Natalie turned the gold-plated faucet in the sink. A brief sputter of brown, rusty liquid coughed out into the pristine white porcelain basin. Then nothing happened. Not a single drop followed. She hit the faucet with her hand. She tried the shower. She tried the massive soaking tub. The pipes were completely empty. The basic human necessity of running water, something they had taken for granted every single day of their lives, was suddenly and completely gone. She walked back out into the hallway, her face pale with a new level of terror. She told Bradley the water was completely shut off. Bradley did not even look up from his empty glass. He simply muttered that he would call the utility company in the morning and scream at someone until it was fixed. He still did not understand the permanence of their situation. He stood up to pour himself another drink from the bar cart. He reached for a crystal decanter. At that exact second, the master breaker for the entire estate received the remote termination signal from the regional power grid. The massive crystal chandeliers in the living room flickered once, buzzed loudly, and died. Every single light in the 20,000-square-foot mansion went completely black. The low, constant hum of the central heating and air conditioning units ground to a heavy halt. The massive refrigerators in the kitchen powered down. The silence that fell over the house was absolute and terrifying. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a massive machine dying. The only light left in the entire room came from the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Bradley dropped the crystal decanter. It shattered against the hardwood floor in the pitch-black room. Natalie let out a sharp scream. She fumbled in the dark, pulling out her cellular phone and turning on the small flashlight feature. The weak beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the terrified faces of my daughter and her husband. The true physical reality of their helplessness began to set in immediately. The house was no longer a symbol of their elite status. It was a massive, empty cavern. Without the central heating system running, the bitter Connecticut cold began to seep through the thick glass windows and the stone walls. The imported marble floors they loved to show off to their friends suddenly became glacial blocks of ice beneath their feet. They did not know how to build a fire in the massive stone fireplaces because they had always relied on the automated gas starters, which were now completely disabled. They were trapped in a freezing dark tomb of their own making. They had no cars to drive to a hotel. Even if they could walk miles in the freezing dark to find a taxi, their credit cards were completely useless. Their cellular phones, their only connection to the outside world, were steadily dropping in battery power with absolutely no way to charge them. They were completely isolated from the society they had tried so hard to impress. I watched through the night vision lenses of the security cameras as they huddled together on the living room sofa. They wrapped themselves in heavy blankets, shivering uncontrollably. They looked like two lost children who had finally wandered too far into the deep woods. The arrogance was completely gone. The entitlement had been frozen right out of them. They were forced to sit in the pitch-black silence and face the absolute ruin of their lives. They had nothing to distract them from their own failures. They could not turn on the television. They could not browse the internet. They could only sit there in the freezing dark and think about the man they had thrown away like garbage. I watched the screen for another hour. I watched them shiver. I watched them realize that nobody was coming to save them. Their wealthy friends would not answer their calls for help. Their fake social circle would abandon them the second they smelled the poverty. They were entirely alone. The battery indicator on the security camera feed began to blink red on my laptop screen. The 2 hours of backup power were almost entirely depleted. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had given them every opportunity to be decent human beings. They had chosen greed and cruelty. This dark, freezing house was the exact physical manifestation of their own cold hearts. The camera feed flickered on my screen. The image distorted for a second, and then the screen went completely black. The connection was permanently severed. I closed my laptop and set it on the coffee table. I walked into the warm, brightly lit bedroom of my hotel suite. I pulled the heavy, soft duvet back and climbed into the comfortable bed. For the first time in 3 years, I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The absolute silence of the freezing house was suddenly shattered by 3 sharp, heavy knocks echoing from the main entryway. The sound ripped through the dark living room like a gunshot. Bradley jumped from his seat on the leather sofa, his eyes wide with sudden terror. He did not move toward the foyer. The arrogant man who loved to bark orders at his servants and scream at tow truck drivers was completely paralyzed by the simple sound of a visitor in the dark. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and stared blindly toward the hallway. He knew perfectly well that friends do not knock on your door when your entire house is completely dark. Natalie looked at her husband with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. She realized that the strong, capable provider she thought she had married was nothing more than a coward hiding in the shadows of a house he did not own. She stood up, pulling her silk robe tightly against the bitter cold. She held her cellular phone in front of her, using the weak flashlight beam to navigate the dark hallway. Her expensive heels clicked slowly against the freezing marble floor. She reached the massive wooden front doors and hesitated for a moment. Another series of heavy knocks pounded against the wood. She unlocked the deadbolt with trembling fingers and slowly pulled the heavy door open. A man stood on the dark front porch holding a powerful industrial flashlight. He was not a police officer, and he was not a utility worker. He wore a plain gray suit and held a thick manila envelope in his gloved hand. He did not look intimidated by the massive dark estate or the terrified woman standing in the doorway. He was a professional process server hired by Mitchell to deliver the final physical blow of the evening. He shined his flashlight slightly downward to avoid blinding her and asked if she was Natalie. His voice was completely flat and strictly business. Natalie nodded her head slowly, her teeth chattering from the freezing air rushing into the foyer. She confirmed her identity. The man stepped forward and firmly pressed the thick manila envelope directly into her hands. He stated clearly for the record that she had been officially served. He did not offer any further explanation or empty apologies. He turned around, walked down the sweeping concrete steps, and got into an unmarked car parked on the street. He drove away, leaving her standing alone in the dark doorway, holding the heavy envelope. Natalie pushed the heavy front door shut and locked the deadbolt. She leaned against the cold wood and aimed her phone light at the envelope. Her name was printed on the front in bold black ink. She tore the thick paper open and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. Bradley crept out of the dark living room, standing a few feet away like a frightened child waiting to hear the bad news. Natalie began to read the top page aloud, her voice shaking violently as her eyes scanned the heavy legal terminology. The document was a formal notice from the Board of Directors of the Evelyn Memorial Charitable Trust. It stated clearly that the property had been officially transitioned into a domestic violence shelter organization. Because the charitable trust required immediate access to begin facility renovations, any and all current occupants were legally classified as unlawful squatters. The document gave them exactly 72 hours to completely vacate the premises. If they did not remove themselves and their personal belongings by the deadline, the charity would involve local law enforcement to execute a forced physical eviction. Bradley let out a pathetic whimpering sound. The bridge loan he had so arrogantly planned to secure was completely dead. The house was already gone. But the eviction notice was not the final page in the envelope. Natalie flipped to the second document. Her breath caught in her throat. She stopped reading aloud. Her eyes widened in absolute unadulterated horror as she stared at the numbers printed on the page. Bradley demanded to know what it said, but she could not speak. Mitchell had included a comprehensive itemized bill. For the past 3 years, Natalie and Bradley had lived in the massive estate, completely rent-free, operating under the arrogant assumption that the property was their birthright. But legally, they were month-to-month tenants. The document calculated the fair market rental value of the 20,000-square-foot estate at $25,000 a month. It multiplied that massive number by 36 months. Added to that total were the specific costs of the landscaping, the pool maintenance, and the premium property insurance they had never paid a single dime toward. The final number printed at the bottom of the page was a legally binding demand for over $1 million in unpaid back rent and stolen services. If they tried to fight the eviction, or if they tried to run, Mitchell would file a massive civil lawsuit using this exact document to garnish whatever meager wages they might ever earn for the rest of their miserable lives. They were not just losing the house. They were being buried alive under a mountain of insurmountable debt. The trap was perfectly executed. The invisible glass walls had completely closed in and crushed them. Natalie dropped the papers onto the freezing marble floor. The fight was completely gone from her body. The entitlement had been burned away by the harsh reality of absolute ruin. She finally understood the true cost of treating her own father like garbage. She fell to her knees in the dark foyer, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Bradley sank down against the wall next to her, completely broken and silent. Miles away in the warmth of my hotel suite, my cellular phone lit up on the nightstand. I reached over and picked it up. It was a text message from Natalie. There were no demands. There were no accusations or arrogant threats. It was the desperate plea of a drowning woman who realized her own father was the only person on earth who could throw her a life preserver. She typed that they had received the papers. She begged me for mercy. She said they had absolutely nothing left and nowhere to go. She pleaded with me to just tell her what I wanted them to do. I looked at the glowing screen for a long time. The adjustment was almost entirely complete. I did not type out a long explanation. I did not offer her a shoulder to cry on. I opened the keyboard and typed a single line of text. I gave her the exact street address for Mitchell Law Office and told her to be there at 9:00 sharp tomorrow morning. I sent the message and turned the phone off for the night. The final reckoning was waiting for them at sunrise. The morning air in the city was sharp and unforgiving as my private driver pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Mitchell and his senior partners. I arrived at 8:30, exactly 30 minutes before our scheduled meeting. I did not wear the casual, soft sweaters or the simple slacks I used to wear around the quiet estate. Today, I wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a solid navy tie. It was the exact armor I used to wear decades ago when I was actively acquiring commercial properties and dismantling rival development firms. I took the private executive elevator directly up to the 40th floor. The main reception area of the law firm was a sprawling expanse of polished black granite and frosted glass. It was an environment designed entirely to intimidate anyone who walked through the doors. It was a place where massive corporate destinies were decided and where weakness was immediately identified and punished. Mitchell was already waiting for me in the primary conference room. The massive oak table was perfectly clear, except for two thick manila folders placed precisely at the opposite end. I took my seat at the head of the table facing the heavy, transparent doors. I felt absolutely no anxiety in my chest. I only felt the cold, heavy weight of total finality. At precisely 9:00, the main glass doors to the reception area slid open. I watched through the transparent walls of the conference room as my daughter and her husband stumbled into the pristine corporate environment. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. Just 2 days ago, they were the flawless, arrogant power couple hosting venture capitalists and demanding absolute servitude from everyone around them. Today, they looked like refugees fleeing a war zone of their own making. Natalie was wearing the exact same designer clothes she had worn the day before. Her expensive sweater was deeply wrinkled and stained from sleeping in it. Her hair, which was usually styled to absolute perfection, was tangled and completely unkempt. The bitter cold of the lightless estate had drained every ounce of color from her face, leaving her looking hollow and deeply aged. Bradley was in an even worse state. He had not shaved and dark circles hung heavily under his eyes. His posture, which he usually kept unnaturally straight to project false dominance, was completely hunched. He looked around the intimidating law office with wide, terrified eyes, jumping slightly every time a junior paralegal walked past him in the busy hallway. They had spent the entire night freezing in the dark without food or running water, and the absolute reality of their complete financial annihilation was written clearly across their exhausted, terrified faces. Mitchell walked out to the reception area and instructed them to follow him inside. He did not offer them coffee or a warm glass of water. He did not ask them how they were doing or offer any pleasantries. He treated them with the exact same clinical cold detachment he would use for a hostile corporate opponent during a vicious litigation settlement. They walked into the conference room and stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me sitting calmly at the head of the massive table. Natalie took a small, hesitant step forward. Her eyes welled up with heavy tears, and her mouth trembled violently. She was desperately searching my face for any sign of the soft, forgiving father she had effortlessly manipulated for her entire adult life. She was looking for the quiet man who would simply sigh, write a massive check, and make all of her terrible consequences instantly go away. I did not give her a single inch of comfort. I kept my expression completely blank and my posture perfectly rigid. I stared back at her not as a broken parent, but as the absolute master of the massive estate she had tried to blindly steal. Bradley desperately tried to pull together whatever miserable shreds of dignity he had left. He pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and collapsed into it, letting out a long, dramatic sigh, as if he was the victim of a massive, terrible injustice. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to launch into a rehearsed, arrogant speech about how I had overreacted and how we could all just go back to the house to work this out quietly. Before he could even form the first syllable, I raised my right hand slightly from the table. The simple, silent gesture carried so much absolute, undeniable authority that his jaw snapped shut instantly. The heavy silence in the room stretched on for several long, agonizing minutes. I let them sit there in the quiet room, breathing in the expensive, conditioned air, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the power dynamic, completely reversing. They finally understood that they were not in control and that they had never truly been in control. They were entirely at my mercy, sitting in a room built by the exact wealth they had so foolishly disrespected. I finally broke the thick silence. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly even. I looked directly at Natalie and reminded her of the very last conversation we had in the marble kitchen of the estate. I repeated her exact words back to her slowly and deliberately. I reminded her that she had demanded I serve her husband or get out of the house. I told her that I had simply followed her cruel instructions to the letter. I had gotten out, and I had taken the entire financial foundation of their fake reality with me. I watched the tears finally spill over her eyelashes and run down her pale, freezing cheeks. She opened her mouth to apologize, to tell me she was desperate and terrified and deeply sorry. I cut her off immediately. I told her that apologies were a currency accepted only by people who still had a relationship, and that our relationship had permanently ended the moment she handed me a servant shirt. I looked over at Bradley, who was staring down at the polished wood table, completely unable to meet my eyes. I told them both that we were not here today to discuss family matters or broken feelings. We were here strictly to discuss the legal and financial terms of their total surrender. Mitchell stepped forward from the corner of the quiet room and placed his hands firmly on the two thick folders resting on the table. The final reckoning had officially begun. Bradley shifted his weight in the heavy leather chair and desperately tried to rebuild the arrogant facade that had defined his entire adult life. He sat up straight and adjusted the lapels of his wrinkled suit jacket. He took a deep breath and attempted to project the commanding presence of a powerful corporate executive, but he only managed to look like a frightened man playing a very dangerous game of dress-up. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Mitchell and launched into a loud, aggressive monologue. He declared that he had spent the entire night consulting with top-tier real estate attorneys. He claimed they had assured him that the commercial lockout and the residential eviction were completely illegal under state law. He raised his voice, hoping the volume would somehow mask the absolute terror in his eyes. He demanded the immediate return of his vehicles. He demanded the padlocks be removed from his downtown office space before noon. He scoffed at the massive bill for back rent, calling it a laughable intimidation tactic that would be thrown out of any civil court in the country. He threatened to sue my holding company for extreme emotional distress, breach of implied contract, and unlawful deprivation of property. He even turned his aggressive gaze toward me, threatening to go to the local media and expose me as an abusive, vindictive old man who was actively trying to destroy his own daughter. He said he would drag my name through the mud until I was forced to settle the matter quietly. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table and watched him dig his own grave. I did not interrupt his frantic speech. I did not bother to defend my character or argue against his ridiculous, fabricated legal theories. I simply let him exhaust the very last reserves of his fake bravado. Beside him, Natalie sat completely frozen. She watched her husband with a glimmer of desperate hope in her eyes, silently praying that his aggressive posturing meant he actually possessed a hidden advantage. She desperately wanted to believe that Bradley was the brilliant strategist he always claimed to be. Bradley finally finished his desperate tirade, He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, and waited for us to surrender. He genuinely expected Mitchell to nervously apologize and offer a generous financial settlement to avoid a messy public lawsuit. Mitchell did not apologize. Mitchell did not even blink. He looked down at his expensive gold watch, checking the time with absolute utter boredom. Then he reached forward and slowly opened the thick manila folder resting on his side of the polished oak table. He did not pull out the commercial lease agreements. He did not pull out the charitable trust documents or the eviction notices. He bypassed all the civil matters entirely. He reached his hand deep into the folder and pulled out a small, neat stack of high-quality printed paper. Mitchell placed his hand flat on top of the documents and pushed them slowly across the long wooden table. The papers glided smoothly over the polished surface and came to a complete stop exactly 1 inch away from Bradley's resting hands. Bradley frowned, his arrogant sneer faltering slightly. He leaned forward and looked down at the top page. I watched the exact moment his entire world violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His breathing stopped completely. His eyes widened in absolute unadulterated horror as he recognized the bright blue logo of the premium commercial bank he had visited just 24 hours prior. He was staring directly at the emergency commercial bridge loan applications he had personally submitted to Mr. Stanton. Mitchell began to speak. His voice was no longer flat and clinical. It was sharp, surgical, and completely merciless. Mitchell calmly informed Bradley that the senior banking official he had tried to manipulate was a close personal friend of the firm. Mitchell explained that the bank had immediately flagged the loan application the second the blind trust was identified on the county registry. But the bank did not just reject the loan. They secured the forged documents and immediately forwarded them to the primary account holder for verification. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked Bradley dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. He explained that submitting falsified property tax records to a federally insured financial institution is not a simple civil dispute. It is a severe federal crime. Mitchell listed the specific criminal statutes with terrifying precision. He defined the exact parameters of federal wire fraud. He defined the legal boundaries of aggravated identity theft, specifically noting the deliberate forgery of a senior citizen signature to illegally secure a $3 million commercial payout. Bradley tried to speak, but his throat was completely paralyzed. Only a dry, miserable rasp escaped his lips. He stared at the perfectly forged signature at the bottom of the page. He knew there was a massive digital trail leading directly back to his computer. He knew the bank lobby possessed high-definition security footage of him handing those exact fraudulent documents directly to the loan officer. He was trapped in a web of his own arrogant criminality. Mitchell was not finished. He stated the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for the combined federal charges. He clearly articulated that Bradley was currently looking at a minimum of 20 years inside a federal penitentiary. He explained that in federal court there is no early parole, and there are no suspended sentences for multi-million-dollar bank fraud. Natalie leaned over her husband's shoulder to look at the papers. Her eyes darted across the forged signatures and the fake collateral declarations. The realization hit her like a physical strike. She grabbed Bradley by the arm, her fingers digging deeply into his expensive suit jacket. She asked him in a horrified whisper what he had done. She asked him if he had actually tried to steal her father's house behind her back. Bradley could not look at her. He could not look at me. He simply stared blindly at the polished wood table, his entire body trembling violently. Mitchell leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. He quietly informed them that the federal authorities had not yet been contacted. He stated that the exact file sitting on the conference table was currently the only physical copy of the internal bank fraud alert. The heavy silence returned to the room, but the power dynamic had fundamentally and permanently shifted. Bradley was no longer a man fighting to keep a luxury sports car or a downtown office space. He was a criminal fighting to keep his physical freedom. He was no longer negotiating for money. He was begging for his life. He slowly raised his head and looked down the long table at me. The arrogant executive was completely dead. The man sitting in the chair was nothing more than a terrified hostage staring directly at the executioner. The invisible trap had snapped completely shut. Checkmate. I shifted my gaze away from the broken man at the table and turned my attention entirely to my daughter. Natalie was shaking uncontrollably. She looked at me with a pleading, desperate expression that I had seen 1,000 times before. It was the exact same look she used when she crashed her first car as a teenager and fully expected me to simply buy her a new one. It was the look of a deeply spoiled child who fundamentally believed that severe consequences were strictly for other people. But she was not a teenager anymore. She was a grown woman who had actively participated in my humiliation, and she was finally out of second chances. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told her that for years I had quietly watched her and Bradley build a life entirely out of smoke and mirrors. I said I had deliberately stayed in the guest wing, hoping that my close proximity would somehow spark a sense of genuine family connection. Instead, my silent presence only served to inflate their massive egos. They looked at my quiet demeanor and mistook it for senility. They looked at my endless generosity and mistook it for their own personal piggy bank. I paused for a long moment, letting my words sink into the heavy, quiet air of the conference room. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the polished oak table, and reminded her of the exact words she had spoken to me in the marble kitchen. I told her I would never forget the cold sound of her voice when she shoved that cheap white shirt into my chest. "Serve my husband," she had said. "Serve my husband or get out, because we do not have room for a freeloader." I let out a short, hollow laugh that echoed sharply off the glass walls. I told her that she was completely right. There was absolutely no room for a freeloader in that massive estate. That is exactly why I removed the 2 biggest freeloaders who had ever set foot inside it. I explained that I did not simply pack my leather suitcase and walk away in defeat. I walked away to initiate a complete and total financial reset. I wanted to see exactly how long their perfect elite lifestyle would last when they actually had to pay for it themselves. The answer was less than 48 hours. Natalie buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved as she sobbed loudly into her palms. She tried to mumble a frantic apology through her tears, saying she was stressed and panicked about the failing dinner party, and that she did not mean any of the cruel things she had said. I stopped her immediately, raising my hand to cut off her pathetic excuses. I told her that extreme stress does not create a toxic personality. Stress simply reveals what is already hiding beneath the surface. She had shown me exactly who she was, and I had finally decided to believe her. Bradley was still staring blindly at the forged bank documents resting on the table. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and completely devoid of his usual blinding arrogance. He asked me in a raspy, broken whisper what I was going to do to him. He asked if I was really going to send him to a federal penitentiary and completely ruin his life over a stupid, desperate mistake. I looked at him with absolute, pure disgust. I told him that he had ruined his own life the exact moment he decided to steal from the man who was keeping a roof over his head. I told him I had absolutely no desire to spend the next 5 years of my peaceful retirement sitting in sterile federal courtrooms, dealing with expensive lawyers and aggressive prosecutors just to watch him rot in a concrete cell. I had a completely different punishment in mind, one that would be far more educational for a man obsessed with money and fake social status. I looked over at Mitchell. Mitchell gave a brief silent nod and pulled a second set of legal documents from his heavy leather briefcase. He placed 2 thick, bound contracts directly in front of Natalie and Bradley. Beside each contract, he placed a heavy black fountain pen. I explained the exact terms of their survival. I told them that the only way Bradley was walking out of this law office as a free man was if they both signed the documents resting in front of them without a single argument. The contracts were legally binding declarations of total financial relinquishment. By signing those pages, Natalie was officially and permanently removing herself as an heir to the Evelyn Memorial Trust. She was legally forfeiting any and all future claims to my estate, my holding companies, my massive bank accounts, and my personal assets. She was agreeing in writing that upon my eventual death, she would receive absolutely nothing. Furthermore, the contract included an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a permanent legal restraining order. They were never to contact me again for any reason. They were never to approach the charitable domestic violence shelter that now occupied my former estate. They were to walk out of the glass doors of this corporate law firm with nothing but the wrinkled clothes currently on their backs, and they were to never look back. If they ever tried to challenge the legal agreement in civil court, Mitchell would immediately unseal the bank fraud evidence and hand it directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I looked at the clock on the wall and gave them exactly 2 minutes to make their choice. I told them they could either sign away their unearned inheritance and walk away free, or they could refuse to sign, and Bradley could try to explain his brilliant business strategies to a federal judge. There was absolutely no hesitation. There was no grand debate or arrogant posturing. The absolute terrifying reality of federal prison had completely crushed whatever microscopic amount of pride Bradley had left. His shaking hand reached out and grabbed the heavy black pen. He did not even bother to read the specific clauses of the contract. He flipped frantically directly to the last page and signed his name. His signature was sloppy and erratic, completely different from the confident, smooth strokes he had used to forge my name on the bank documents just a day before. He pushed the heavy contract toward his wife. Natalie looked at the pen for a very long moment. She looked at me one last time, desperately searching my cold eyes for any remaining trace of her forgiving father. She found nothing but a blank, impenetrable wall. She picked up the pen and signed her name on the dotted line. The dark ink bled slightly into the thick, expensive paper. She dropped the pen onto the oak table as if the metal had physically burned her fingers. They had made their final choice. They had traded their entire future fortune for their immediate physical freedom. They were officially and permanently severed from my life and my legacy. Mitchell calmly collected the signed documents, checking the signatures before placing them carefully back into his briefcase. He snapped the gold locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet conference room, signaling the absolute end of the silent adjustment. I stood up from the heavy oak table and slowly buttoned my suit jacket. I did not offer them a parting glance or a final word of advice. I simply turned my back on the two people who had mistaken my quiet patience for pathetic weakness and walked out of the glass conference room. Mitchell followed me out to the private executive elevator. We shook hands firmly in the quiet hallway. There was no need for a lengthy, emotional goodbye. We had successfully executed the exact strategy we had meticulously set in motion. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, I felt a massive physical weight completely lift from my shoulders. For the first time in 3 long years, I was no longer carrying the crushing, toxic burden of their endless entitlement. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped directly into the bright morning sunlight. The crisp city air filled my lungs, and it tasted entirely like freedom. My private driver was already waiting at the curb, with the rear door of my luxury sedan held wide open. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and gave him a single, simple instruction. I told him to take me directly to the international airport. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb and merged into the busy city traffic, my cellular phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure message from the primary board of directors overseeing the charitable trust. They had attached a series of high-resolution photographs documenting the immediate progress at the Connecticut property. The massive wrought iron gates of the estate were currently propped wide open. Large commercial moving trucks and professional cleaning crews were already swarming the expansive green grounds. I scrolled slowly through the images. The grand living room where Natalie and Bradley had shivered in the freezing dark just hours ago was being filled with warm, comfortable furniture. It was being specifically designed to welcome women and children who had absolutely nowhere else to go. The sprawling east guest wing that I had quietly occupied for years was being rapidly converted into a fully staffed legal and medical counseling center. I looked at the digital pictures and felt a profound, deep warmth spread through my entire chest. I had finally kept the sacred promise I made to Evelyn shortly before she passed away. Our beautiful home was no longer a hollow, cold monument to arrogance and boundless greed. It was officially a true sanctuary of healing and vital second chances. The highway stretched out endlessly before me, leading directly toward a completely new chapter of my existence. I was not a broken, defeated old man running away from his miserable problems. I was a wealthy, highly independent man who had finally decided to spend his hard-earned resources strictly on his own happiness. Several months ago, long before the disastrous dinner party had even occurred, I had quietly purchased a beautifully restored stone villa nestled high in the rolling green hills of Tuscany. Evelyn and I had always talked at length about moving to Italy when I finally retired from the demanding commercial real estate business. We had spent countless hours sitting together looking at travel brochures and dreaming of drinking strong, dark espresso on a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the ancient vineyards. She tragically never got the chance to make that beautiful journey. But I was going to live that dream for both of us, honoring her memory with every single sunset. My vintage leather suitcase was already waiting securely in the trunk of the car. I had my passport safely tucked into the breast pocket of my tailored suit. I did not need anything else. I was leaving behind the cold, heavy expectations of a family that only valued me for the balance of my bank accounts. I would never know where Natalie and Bradley went after they walked out of that corporate law firm with absolutely nothing, and I genuinely did not care. My parental duty to them had officially ended the exact second they shattered the basic foundation of human decency and respect. They were completely erased from my ledger. As the driver pulled up to the private aviation terminal, I took a long, quiet moment to reflect on the brutal but necessary adjustment I had just completed. I learned a devastating but incredibly vital lesson over the past few days. I learned that true family is absolutely not defined by shared blood or a common last name. True family is defined by mutual respect, genuine gratitude, and unconditional love. I realized that setting absolute ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty or malice. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. You simply cannot allow toxic people to continuously drain your precious resources and your spirit just because you happen to share a biological connection. You must protect your own peace at all costs, even if it means walking entirely away from the people you once held dear. Now at 70 years old, I am finally living the authentic, peaceful life I always truly deserved. I spend my quiet mornings walking through the vibrant local markets in Italy, smelling the fresh bread and the blooming cypress trees. I spend my warm evenings reading classic literature quietly by a crackling stone fire. I have made wonderful new friends in the village who value my company and my gentle wisdom rather than the heavy limits of my credit cards. And most importantly, I look in the mirror every single morning, and I deeply respect the strong, resilient man staring back at me. And that, my friends, is the absolute most valuable lesson of my entire story. Did you like how I handled the situation with my daughter and her husband? What would you have done if your own child demanded you serve their guests like a disposable hired hand? Let me know your honest thoughts, and please tell me which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you found genuine value in my story, please support me by sending a super thanks and hitting the like button so I can continue sharing these powerful life lessons. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for for more incredible stories of absolute justice and personal strength. See you in the next video.